All right, so we're going to talk about accessibility now. Web component accessibility in particular, but also accessibility on the web in general. I don't know how much we covered of that in your HTML, CSS section. Not that much? All right, cool. So we will we'll try to do a little bit of an introduction to that. Just one thing, when we abbreviate accessibility, you often do it A11Y, because there are 11 letters between the A and the Y in accessibility. Took me a while to figure out why that was. We do the same thing with internationalization. Same thing. So if you see that, that's what it stands for, accessibility. All right. So what is web accessibility? So the Web Accessibility Initiative, which we'll talk a little bit about that in the WAI, defines it as this. Web accessibility means that people with disabilities can use the web. More specifically, web accessibility means that people with disabilities can perceive, understand, navigate, interact with the web, and that they can contribute to the web. So there are a lot of pieces of this. There are a lot of parts of this. But that those with various types of disabilities can still use the web in all its fullness. And there are a lot of reasons why we do accessibility. There are social factors. We certainly have users who have disabilities who we want to make sure they are able to use their applications. We have technical factors. I actually want to add in here, making an application accessible usually makes it a better experience for all your users, not just users who have disabilities. There are financial factors. Depending on your user base, this might be a large amount of your customers, and it might be something that you really want to keep in mind. And there are also legal and policy factors.
This applies to us.
Yeah, so this is actually usually not a huge issue, but if you're working with anyone, if you're working with any application in government or education or healthcare or a wide range of industries, there are legal and just organizational policy reasons why this is required. And so, there are likely multiple factors that go into your decision to make your application accessible, and that's all right. Just kind of keep in mind what those factors are. It's good to make an application accessible by default, but I think it's also good to think about why we're doing it, because these are going to differ for different situations. So WAI is the Web Accessibility Initiative. That's one of the abbreviations. There are a lot of abbreviations in the accessibility world. WAI is one of them. It's an organization that promotes web accessibility. The WCAG are guidelines that they put out for web content accessibility guidelines. We have another abbreviation coming up later. So the W3C, along with WAI, puts out these web content accessibility guidelines, and they have these set of 12 success criteria that they think you need to meet. And they go through these in detail, and I've linked to all of these down at the bottom and on some of these other pages as well. So there are 12 different criteria, 12 different topics that are important. The high-level topics: text alternatives, time-based media, adaptable, distinguishable, keyboard accessible, enough time, being able to, considering seizures, and navigable, readable, predictable, input assistance, compatible. These are kind of all the topics. We don't have time to go through all of them. So I'm going to try to touch on 4 of them that I think are particularly important and particularly relevant to the web. I mean, they're all important, but I'm going to touch on 4 that I think give good examples. So first, our text alternatives, and I'm only touching on part of each of these 4. There are extensive checklists for each of these that you can take a look at for very specific points. But text alternatives is so that we can provide text alternatives for any non-text content, so it can be changed into other forms people need, such as large print, braille speech, symbols, or simpler language. So this means that for non-text content, so this is things like images, charts, videos, anything that's not plain text that can be read. This also includes Canvas, which you're not going to be able to read from the machine perspective, from the computer perspective. So a good example here, and I've linked the guidelines specifically because there are a whole bunch of these individual guidelines. So if you have an image, it's very, very important that you have an alt attribute on that image. So alt means alternative text for that image. So I have a Boston.png image here, and that might be a picture of a skyline or something. And the computer's not going to, it's going to run into the image and it's going to say, I don't know what this is, it's just an image called Boston.png. It's just going to read Boston.png. And that's not really useful. I mean, maybe it is in this case because, like I described, I was sort of descriptive in my file name. But a lot of times the file names won't be descriptive. If you ever look at, like, profile pictures on a lot of websites, I believe Twitter still does this, where it'll basically be like a random hash in the file name. So it'll be like A12345 PNG. That's not really helpful at all. And so the alt text is what is supposed to be helpful. So that's going to be a short form of text, if that's all that's necessary to describe it. You can also do long form of alternative text as well, describing the non-text content that is on your page. All right, the next piece is keyboard accessible. So we want to make all functionality available from a keyboard. This is one of my favorite parts of accessibility, just because it's so, I benefit from it so much. So I use the keyboard a lot. I don't always use a mouse. I try to do as much as I can from the keyboard. This is a very developer thing, right? We have Vim, we don't use keyboard, so things like that. So you don't use mice for features that you don't need to. And so it's really frustrating to me when I come to a website that I can't navigate with just a keyboard. So make all functionality keyboard accessible. This is important accessibility-wise because there are those that might not have access to or the ability to use a mouse or may have some other input that they can use, and so it should be usable from the keyboard. One key piece that's important here, one kind of concrete step that you can take, is to use HTML form controls and links. And I think that this is how they phrase it. I want to phrase it as use the element that makes sense for what you're trying to do. A lot of times, we'll talk about semantics in HTML, and semantics for semantics' sake, I don't know. I think semantics has a functionality, and this is one case where it does. And it's not so much that this is a button and that's how it works. Remember, we've learned a lot about elements this week. We've learned a lot about how elements work. And so, remember, button is actually going to inherit from HTML button element. It's going to have a prototype, and on that prototype is going to be functionality that's specific to what a button does. And guess what? Like, we get a bunch of stuff for free when we use that. We get things like if you hit the space bar on a button, it submits. And depending on how adept you are at using the keyboard to navigate websites, you may or may not be familiar with that. But certainly someone who has to do that for every website would be. And so it's very frustrating when they get to a button on the page and it's not actually a button. It just maybe looks like one, but it's not actually a button. That's problematic. And so then when hitting spacebar, you don't get submit, and so that's a problem. So even if you don't use a button, for whatever reason you can't, make sure that you can still access all functionality from a keyboard as would be expected. A link is another great example. And frankly, the difference between a link and a button. So a link goes somewhere, a button does something. That's how I remember it. There are more technical definitions, but keep those in mind. If you're writing a link and you have to do like href, and you have to do like some hacky thing so like it doesn't actually go to a URL, like JavaScript void or something like that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's good, don't worry about it. But there are ways you can like hijack links. You can hijack links with JavaScript, that's fine, but you still should have a fallback to an href that actually goes somewhere. All right, the next one is navigable. Provide ways to help users navigate, find content, and determine where they are. This is particularly important when you're on screen readers or when you're just tabbing through an application on your keyboard. Focus order is so important. And I know this is pretty small text, so I'll read it. If a web page can be navigated sequentially and the navigation sequences affect meaning or operation, focusable components receive focus in an order that preserves meaning and operability. So sometimes our HTML isn't written in the same order that really provides meaning to the user. So maybe we put our sidebar in the middle of our HTML, or we put it way down at the bottom, or something else. Maybe there are reasons that that's the case, but you need to make sure that when the user is able to tab through the application with their keyboard, that they're able to tab through, they're able to focus through the application in a meaningful way. so a lot of elements have natural tab order if they're focusable. So if an element is focusable, it has a natural tab order. You can reinforce that with tab index 0. That will put the standard tab, put the element into the standard tab order. And so if that would be a helpful way to put an element into the standard kind of expected order with the flow of the document. A lot of times things are not in tab order, but we still need them to be focusable. Imagine a drop-down menu, for example, where you can drop down a menu, a navigation menu, and then you can open up. You have a little arrow. You can open up an item and have another menu and dive into that and dive into that. You can see that these items might not be in the same natural focusable order once you open up one of the menus. And so you might need to programmatically control how that focus works. Another example is if you open up a pop-up on the page. And the pop-ups are usually hidden down at the bottom of the page somewhere in a div, because there's only one ever on a page if you have a modal pop-up. And then when you pop it up, you just display it, right, and display it on top of everything. But you should be allowing the user to have focus within that pop-up, and so they should be able to tab within that pop-up just fine. And so if you're not careful about this, if you don't write code to support this, they're not going to be able to. So that's what a tab index -1 is for. So tab index -1 will actually remove the element from tab order, but still make it programmatically focusable. This means that you can call .focus on it, and you're going to need to write some code to handle this. But the key is that you kind of pull it out of the tab order and then write code to take care of it. So this last one is tab index any positive number, so any non-zero positive number. And this will actually manually order the tab index. So if you had 3 items, you could put them in order like 3, 2, 1 or 1, 2, 3, and that would manually order it. These should not be used with web components. And the reason we shouldn't use a manual tab order index with web components is because we don't know where web components are going to be on our page. And so if we have a web component and we say, well, this is, we know this is going to be the 3rd item on the page. Well, it might be in your example. But as soon as the user takes it and puts it somewhere else, or someone building an application takes it and puts it somewhere else, it's going to be out of that tab index, out of that tab order. So you don't really want to manually order, kind of hard code manual order tab index with web components. And the last one is input assistance, help users avoid incorrect mistakes. So inputs are a large part of how we use the web, and I mentioned this earlier in the week when we were talking about components, but whenever you have an input field, you have to have an ID field. Sorry, whenever you have an input field, you have to have a label field alongside it, and that's very important. Because otherwise you're going to get to the input field and not know what it's for. Maybe there's a div up here, maybe the div just says name, and so visually it looks fine, but if you're not working through this application visually, that's not going to make any sense. The computer can't figure out what the label is for that input. And so when we talk about accessibility with forms, is that every label should have a for attribute, and the for attribute should refer to the ID of the input that it is tied to. And so this means that, label for name field, input ID name field. And the good news here is that there's only going to be one name field per document, because we know IDs are unique per document, so we don't need to worry about scoping or anything. And now a screen reader or another device can interpret what this means. You also get another instance of how you get kind of bonus features here, even if you're not a user with disabilities, is on mobile phones, for example. If you click a label in a form on a mobile phone, a lot of times it'll focus the input associated with it, or check the box associated with it, or something like that. So as you add more meaning and more of these kind of technical features to your applications, to your components, they can be consumed in smarter ways. And that has benefits for everyone. All right, the last abbreviation is WAI, Web Accessibility Initiative, Aria, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And so Aria are a set of technologies that allow us to describe what we call rich internet applications, more interactive internet applications. Because the alts and labels and whatnot are helpful, but as our applications become more and more interactive, this becomes limiting, becomes more document-oriented, and so we might not have the flexibility we need. So Aria came along and provided us that. So Aria, we have a few different things. First, we have roles. So this is a new attribute The role attribute describes widgets that aren't otherwise available in HTML. So this is how we can add added semantics to our HTML elements that we wouldn't normally have available. We have properties to describe characteristics of those widgets. And we have states to describe current interaction state of an element. So we can describe those sort of widgets that aren't normally available in HTML, and we can also describe the state of an element that we wouldn't ordinarily have information about. So some examples. Roles. We use roles with the role attribute, and then we pass the value in here for the name of the attribute. There's a list of those available at these URLs. I've included them on all three of these pages here. I've also included a selection of them that might give you an idea of how they're used. So we have an ordered list with an li of tabs, with li's for each tab. But if you just look at this, all you see is an ordered list, and maybe you can visually see the ID says tab 1, and so maybe you can guess this is tabs. But programmatically, the device is not able to figure out this is a tab list. And we have an understanding of what a tab list is. It's one of the predefined widgets that Aria defines and understands. And so you can use tab list as a role because it's one of these predefined items. Again, they're all at this URL. You could also have something like dialog or marquee, tree, tooltip, timer, spin button, slider, separator. So all these sort of roles we can pass in and give some more meaning to our elements for devices that wouldn't otherwise be able to know that these widgets, as Aria refers to them, are.
Andrew, just to clarify, this roles is not for necessarily for web components.
It's for both, yeah. Sorry, everything so far has been for all HTML plus web components.
Right.
Yes, good point. All right, properties. These are Aria dash properties. So you'll see them in, they call them properties, but they are used as attributes here. So Aria dash labeled by, Aria dash required. And so this is able to give some more semantics to our elements in terms of how they're being used. So these work for existing elements as well as those custom widgets that we looked at. We have things like described by, labeled by for forms, multi-selectable, read-only, required is helpful. A lot of times when we fill out forms, before HTML5 we didn't have that nice required attribute. So Aria required helps us out there. Relevant, multi-line, value min, has pop-up, autocomplete, things like that.
So now, these are things we add to the HTML that will make it more accessible because the readers will pick it up, or just that it'll help understand some net? I'm trying to...
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. These devices that need more information about the application can use these values. So screen readers is part of it. Other devices certainly could as well.
So they will understand what Aria autocomplete.
Yes.
It's not as if that's going to be read out. They go, oh, when I see this,
Exactly.
I tell the user this.
Exactly. Or maybe it works a different way because I know this is an autocomplete. Yeah, these are specific. So these are like a predefined list. These aren't just like arbitrary values. These are predefined lists that the Web Accessibility Initiative has worked with the W3C to define. We can also use this for things like regions of the page that update in the background, say over time. Imagine you had like a little block that updated with the latest stock price for a company. Right, when that updates, the user, if you're visually looking at the page, you might see it update, but if you were using your keyboard to go through the page using a screen reader or something, where you didn't necessarily have insight into knowing that changed, you can let Aria know that it's changed, and also let Aria know, is this important enough? Is this like an alert, or is this something that like when the user's, not doing anything, we'll let them know that it changed?
I feel like I always feel like I'm at least knowledgeable, and I had not heard of Aria. So this is the first I've heard of it. Is it relatively new, or have I just been out of touch?
It's been around for a few years. It's definitely around. It's one of. It depends kind of what area you're in, but it is definitely a part of accessibility that's been around for a while. Whether or not you've worked with it would depend on the situation. But yeah, label by is a common way. So for example, with a label and input, we can use the for, but then on the input itself, we can say Aria labeled by name label and point it to the ID there. Aria required false, things like that. So states are very similar properties. They also work as an attribute here, but it's a true or false. It's a Boolean value. And they actually go to the same, they're listed at the same URL here. So you can just click there. It says things like busy, something else is happening there. Disabled, expanded, if you had an accordion, for example. Grabbed, if something was grabbed. Hidden, invalid, pressed. So these are states. There are less of them than there are properties. All right, so testing accessibility with screen reader. There are certainly other devices for users with disabilities to use to access the web. And a screen reader is one of the more common ones. So it's the one I'm going to demo. Also, it's the only one I really have access to and familiarity with. So just how to use the screen reader. There are multiple screen readers available. There are multiple software packages you can install on different operating systems. Windows, I know, has JAWS, and there's another one that I'm not as familiar with. There's one available for Chrome as the browser. It has some limitations right now, especially in terms of web components. The one I'm going to demo is Voiceover, and it's probably the most common one that people test with, just because developers have developers frequently have Macs, and it's also built in, so you don't need to install something in addition to it. So it's nice, it's on a Mac only, unfortunately, so if you don't have a Mac, we'll demo it today, and you're welcome to come and take a look and see how it works. If you have a Mac, try it out. To open it up, you just start with Command F5, and then in the abbreviations, we'll go through the controls, but there's this VO control. VO just means control plus option. That's kind of the voiceover control. And then down at the bottom of your page, you're going to see the text of that voiceover is reading out, and then you'll also hear it talk to you. So there are various controls for things like starting reading, stopping reading, going to the next item, previous item, top of page, bottom of page. Next link is just tab. Like that should sound familiar. That's how it works on a browser. Going between headings, going between form controls, activating something on the form control. All right. So I'm going to try to do a little live demo here. So this will be interesting.
This will be fun.
Yeah. All right. This should work with audio, right?
Yeah.
All right.
I think Todd might have turned it down earlier.
Yeah, the volume's down, so just test your volume.
All right. Okay, I'll start it low and then.
Skyfall on YouTube or something.
I don't hear your.
Yeah,
It's not playing yet.
You
Oh, I see what you mean.
And I don't hear your volume indicator.
I got it.
Oh, on here.
And while I'm coming up here, please remember, buy Pepsi Cola. Drink Coke,
No, that's not.
our sponsor. Just
What?
kidding.
Who's our sponsor?
Do this. Pepsi Cola, Coke. I don't know what else is bad for us.
I'm like, wow.
I'm just making it up. Me and Ed.
We're all present.
I'm just. We're still recording, right?
Yep. we are. Oh boy.
I'll take this off and see if it's working. Okay, my keyboard doesn't work. It's not giving me sound anyway. So here, let me just
That's because you're coming.
No, I unplugged. Okay.
Screen and can be used to control the computer using only your keyboard.
Great.
If you already know how to use VoiceOver, press the V key now.
VoiceOver on IntelliJ IDEA, mySlider/index.html, web components exercises, ~web components exercises, Chrome, new tab, window.
Oh, yeah, that's enjoyable.
Address and search bar, edit tab.
You can't see the problem is, right?
IntelliJ IDEA,
All right.
mySlider/index.html, web components exercises, ~tab, closing menu, Chrome, webcomponents.org, window, webcomponents.org, HTML, new tab, subcomponents.
All right. So
Link, my web components style guide, heading level 1, Intel Firefox.
I'm going to make sure I have here.
Table 4, slides, HTML.
It's going to be control option and then next and previous figure.
I think we need to do like a mixed beat to that.
All right.
Mix
So-
that song.
Consecutive releases, heading,
That would be fun.
heading level 2, variable hello badge.
Did you get it?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So we should be in a good place here. So I'm gonna.
Heading level 2, inside HTML content.
So you'll notice it tells me some of these things, right, as I go. If you can't hear it, just look at the text below here. That will kind of fill you in. If I go to the next item,
This is a basic hello world badge in web components.
so then it will talk the description to me.
Heading level 1, hello.
Now, remember how we built this component, right?
You are currently on heading level 1, inside HTML content.
So it'll remind me after where I am. You'll notice here, this was in the shadow DOM, right? And it still read it out normally. So it's reading out rendered nodes, which is incredibly useful.
Heading level 2, Martinez. Heading level 3, world.
All right, so that works. Code isn't going to be very helpful.
Less than variable hello badge greater than less than heading level 2, button. Button. Button.
Now, what I wanted to call out here, while it said button, because I called it a button, the interesting.
Button inside HTML content. To click this button, press Control Option Space.
So the nice thing is this is you're currently on a button, because remember I implemented this with a button inside the shadow DOM. And so the important thing here is that it was able to give me this helpful information. It clicks this button, hit Control Option Space. So if I hit Control Option Space,
Press button. Button.
I'm able to press the button. And so, it's certainly hard to get used to, but I think it's interesting to try it out with your component, with your application.
Heading level 2, slider.
And I can skip over the parts that aren't as good, but I'm guessing, like, for example, my slider,
Level 2, inside HTML content.
I'm guessing my slider isn't very good here, for example, with changing,
Less. Fresno, CA image.
when the image changes, it's not telling me anything, which is probably not that great.
Button inside HTML content.
So if you had a title on that image on your slider, then it would,
Stop.
right?
Yes, I could potentially use an Aria attribute that.
Or an alt tag on the, do you have no, you don't have an alt.
I do have alt text, and it said Fresno CA, so I knew it was an image.
You are currently on heading level 2, inside HTML.
But yeah, it definitely was not as helpful as it could have been. So that's somewhere where I could look at, for example, Aria tags and see if this was something that I could optimize. So all right, well, I'm going to turn off VoiceOver. But yeah, I mean, the first time I did that, how many have ever used a screen reader before?
Yeah, we use the screen reader.
Okay, cool. So a few. Yeah, I think it's helpful to understand how it works. So actually, VoiceOver is available on your phone as well if you have an iPhone or an iPad. And so these sort of devices will work as well. And it's helpful to use it on code that you write and see what it's like. See if you can navigate a form. See if you can navigate a form with keyboard controls only. Things like that I think are very helpful in helping us write accessible web applications. All right, so accessibility plus web components. So far I've been mostly talking about accessibility in general, but I called out some of the shadow DOM points here. The good news is screen readers generally don't have issues with shadow DOM. There are a few screen readers that do right now, but they're mostly pretty solid. And accessibility is especially important with web components, I think, because components are reused, right? Shadow DOM can't be easily modified. So if you're a consumer of a component, and I've made Shadow DOM HTML that's very poorly accessible, maybe I don't use input elements where I should, or I don't use Aria attributes to make it clear that something is an input, then I'm not going to get that information. There's nothing really I can do about it as a consumer of a web component, other than to decide not to use your component, or do without accessibility, or hack around it in a way that's going to be very painful. So I think web components have to be accessible out of the box. I think that's where web components kind of stand out in this, is we're building things that are reusable, we're building things that are going to be used within our applications and potentially other applications. And so making them accessible out of the box is very, very important. So the exercise for this section is to go ahead and try to add some accessibility features to your style guide components. Take a look at your slider, for example, and see if there's something that you can add there. Add information about the changing images. Make sure that any form elements are properly used labels, have Aria labeled by. Make sure that any form elements use proper elements, or use role if they don't. So for example, your button, make sure it uses a button or it uses role equals button. You can actually try that out with role equals button. If you're not using a button, that's one way to kind of simulate that.